All right, welcome back, fellow scientists. So I apologize. This is no way to do this topic justice at all, and I realize I'm going way too fast. I saw one of I saw one of your comments on the wall the other day. I tried to watch this at 2 times speed, and I can't. I'm just wrecked. Well, again, I'm sorry. I like to do that too. I'll listen to podcasts at 2 times speed because it just like you still get the information, but it just takes less time. I totally get it. I understand that. If you're able to do that, good on you. If you're not able to do that, don't worry, that's normal, right? So last time we did our intro to evolution and we talked a little bit about Darwin's great idea of natural selection and kind of how that works. So today we're going to talk about the process of speciation, how we start with one species and how they can actually possibly potentially become two different species. We'll start off with actually what a species is actually because that's the very first thing. There will be a small assignment at the end of this video that I would like you guys to work on today and turn in before the end of the day on Friday. And then short assignment, you should be able to totally finish it. And then everyone's going to have class on Monday. Monday is periods 1 through 7, and so I'm going to make a video about the evidence for evolution. And that'll probably be like a no kidding, like a half an hour video. That's about how long class is, anyways. There will be no assignment associated with that. And then Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever you have class, then there will be a small Microsoft Forms quiz just on those three units, or not 3 units, 3 lectures on evolution. And then that'll be it. Then you'll be done. So please do take notes because next week, Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever you take the test, I do want to see just evidence that you kind of watch these videos and that you actually put stuff down and you actually take notes. So that'll probably be one of the last gradebook items is the notes and then the test. Speaking of that, end of year processes. Usually we do our 5 current event science articles for extra credit. So that's still available if you want to do that. Find an article, send me the link, type up a little summary, and then that'll be 5 extra credit points, limit 5 per semester. Usually I have you turn in your old tests. That's not going to be available this time just because it's not due to CDC guidelines and COVID and stuff like that. And then also you could say Psalm, what is it for this class? Psalm 8. So, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise, right? Because of your enemies silence upon the avenger. Sorry, sometimes I start and I just gotta go all the way through. So anyways, do that. You could make a TikTok, you could we could do a Zoom call, something like that. You could record yourself doing that. So that's also available for extra credit end of the year if you want to do that. All right. So having said that, let's go ahead and let's dive into this process called speciation. And yeah, basically exactly what it says here. We're taking one species and we're looking at potentially how it could turn into two different species, how it could evolve into two different species. So last time we talked about microevolution, changes within a species, right, versus macroevolution, right, a population of animals changing from one species to another, speciation. So we got to go over some vocabulary. So speciation, formation of a new species. Pause this so that you can actually write these things down. These would be good things for your notes. So what is a species? So a species is a group of organisms that breed with one another and produce fertile offspring, right? So you guys might be familiar with a liger. They used to have a liger over at Cattails, right? So a liger is the product of a lion mating with a tiger, right? And they can actually produce a living, breathing organism that could kill you, right, out in the wild. Um, but but ligers are infertile, right? So a lion and a tiger, they can mate and they can produce an offspring, but that offspring is not fertile. Ligers are infertile. You can't have two ligers make more ligers. So that's why lions and tigers are considered two separate species, right? If you have to take a different example, if you have a poodle, right, and a Labrador Retriever, right, they can mate and they can make a labradoodle. And then you can take another labradoodle and you can mate the two labradoodles together, and then they can actually make offspring. So all dogs, all domesticated dogs, are one species with different breeds. Hey, because all of those can mate together and can produce fertile offspring together, can produce hybrids, right? So lions and tigers, they're different because although they can produce offspring, those offspring aren't fertile. So that's our definition of species. That's the most commonly accepted definition of species. If you take AP biology, then we'll talk about that a little bit more because there are a couple of nuances or a couple of exceptions, a couple of different ways to think about it. So because they are interbreeding and because they can produce fertile offspring, we say that one species, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Gene pool is this idea or this concept that in an interbreeding population, it's all of the genes and all of the alleles that make up a population, right? So in a certain gene pool, right? Let's take humans for an example. In a certain gene pool, in a certain group of people, there might not be the allele for red hair. You might not have that anywhere in anyone's genetic makeup, right? Then you have like someone like travel to that place or come in from the outside and then become a part of that group, and then they bring in that allele. So the process of immigration, the process of travel, the process of of kind of mixing all of the people groups on the earth together increases genetic variety and changes the gene pool, changes all of the alleles and all of the genes that are within or that are available to that certain population. So in other words, here's where I was going. Species share a gene pool because they're all interbreeding. They all have the potential to breed and to make fertile offspring with one another. So if the two things do not share a gene pool, if they can't interbreed, if they can't make fertile offspring, then we say that's the dividing line. Then they're different species. So here's kind of another way to think about it, right? Go ahead in class. I ask people to kind of try to do their best to draw this diagram, right? So these little dots, they represent like individual things, individual living things, individual organisms, and then these arrows kind of represent reproduction. So we have this generation right here that breeds and produces this generation right here that breeds and produces this generation right here. So you can kind of think of all of this as kind of the gene pool if we look at the DNA and the genes in these different organisms, right? Now, the way that we get speciation, the way that we can get two separate species is we have to have reproductive isolation. We have to separate the gene pool. So there's three different ways, excuse me, that we could have reproductive isolation: behavioral, geographic, temporal. I'm going to give you examples of each of those. This is just kind of my advanced organizer, right? But I'm using this diagram to kind of explain this idea of gene pool and of speciation, of reproductive isolation, of separating the gene pool. So let's say that there's a behavioral isolation, right? We'll use birds for example. Like there's a mutation, and the one bird can't sing the species specific song, and so the normal birds don't want to produce offspring with that other bird that sings a different song. However, let's say that there are maybe not everyone doesn't want to produce offspring, but maybe there are some that maybe have a concurrent mutation at the same time that they actually kind of like the new song, that they actually kind of think, oh, okay, cool, I can produce offspring with this individual, and so then they'll go off and they'll make their own little clutch and their own little nest, and then those will grow up, right? And then hopefully there's others. They don't have to marry their brother, sister, whatnot. And then they'll so that's one way. That's a behavioral way that we can have reproductive isolation to separate the gene pool. So somehow something comes in and right, like boom, and then never the twain shall meet. And so then this is a separate interbreeding population, and then this is a separate interbreeding population. And so now we've successfully separated the gene pool, and then eventually, if the two types of birds that sing the different songs ever meet or ever come back in the same area, they're not going to want to mate and produce offspring because they don't sing the right song. Right? It's like country and rap. It's just that like never the twain shall meet. It's just they don't go well together. Right? I know, whatever, Old Town Road, fine. But anyways, Three ways that reproductive isolation can happen. So behavioral isolation. If we were in class, we'd watch a Birds of Paradise video from planet Earth. It's amazing. Love the Birds of Paradise. You can look it up. Just Google or YouTube Birds of Paradise video. It's like 3 or 4 minutes or something like that. But God made some beautifully created birds. Some very ornate, very I don't know, very magnificent birds that have different mating rituals, and it's absolutely amazing. So behavioral isolation, if birds have different mating rituals, then they're going to stay separated or they're going to be separated. Eastern and western meadowlarks. So let's see, eastern meadowlark left, so that's over here. Western meadowlark right. They look the same, right? But they have different songs. So that would be a classic example of these used to be just one population of meadowlarks, right? Mutation happened, and so now we have two different songs. We have an Eastern and a Western, East Coast versus West Coast, right? And so that's separating the population. Now, given another couple thousand years, there might be some different mutations in this population that cause them to look different, and there might be some different mutations in this population that cause them to look different. And we would have a really good example of macroevolution actually taking place in a population. The trouble is that macroevolution takes like thousands and thousands of years, and so we don't have any really current good megafauna examples. We could do experiments with macroevolution with bacteria, and they have been done, and we have gotten like different strains of bacteria. But the thing about bacteria is that they reproduce asexually, right? So our definition of species kind of goes out the window that way. And even like totally separate, like we know different bacteria, like there's no question, right? They can actually exchange genetic material. They can send over little plasmids, little small circular pieces of DNA. And so is that exchanging genetic material? Does that make them the same species? Well, no, because like one's a cylinder-shaped bacteria and one is a sphere-shaped bacteria, and the other one's a corkscrew-shaped bacteria, and they're obviously different species, but they can still exchange genetic information. So anyway, that's a little rabbit trail. I digress. It's hard to see macroevolution in megafauna, in big species, species that have like normal reproductive times or longer reproductive times, right? Bacteria reproduce like the fastest. They can reproduce every 20 minutes, and so it's easy to do experiments with those. But I digress. Geographic isolation. So this is where we have one population, and then right, it's physically separated by like a mountain range or a new river comes through, right? Or take it the other way, like if you're a fish, right, and you live in the water, and then the water level in a certain lake goes down, right? And then there's like a sandbar in the middle of the lake. Now all of a sudden, what used to be one lake with an interbreeding population, now the water level is down, and so now it's two lakes, right? Or maybe flooding happens, and then fish from one river kind of like flop over and go over into another river, and then flooding recedes, and then you have like two different non-interbreeding populations. So the example that we're going to use are squirrels in Arizona. Right, so here's the kaibab squirrel. Let's see if we can zoom in. Yep, there we go. Looks like that, right? Here is the Abert squirrel, right? Looks like that, right? To the untrained observer, it's like, yeah, whatever. It's just a gray squirrel, like they're the same. Well, not really. So this is a picture straight out of your book, right? And so it has the ranges of the kaibab and the Albert squirrel, right, through Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. And if you just look at this little blob right here, this pink and this purple blob, it looks like, oh, well, that's kind of one continuous shape. It used to be one population, but we have this little thing right here called the Grand Canyon, right, that actually separates the kaibab and the Albert squirrel. So you can see, like it looks like it's feasible. Like it actually makes sense. It used to be one population. Then the Grand Canyon, over thousands, if not millions of years, was formed. And squirrels aren't like people. Squirrels will not go down into the Grand Canyon and then hike up the other side just for fun, right? People are weird. People are gluttons for punishment. They'll do that. Squirrels are like, well, I got food over here. I got other squirrels over here. like I'm good. I'm not going to go hiking in the Grand Canyon if I don't have to. So that separates those two populations. And this has happened. It seems like this has happened longer ago than the mutation with the meadowlarks that changed the song, right? Because the squirrels actually look physically different. So slightly different environments, right? East side of the canyon, north side of the canyon versus south side of the canyon, right? Slightly different environments and different mutations happening in this gene pool, right? So now we have two different species. So this would be another possible example of macro evolution. Temporal isolation. So temporal, think time. This is the third way that we can have reproductive isolation. So two or more species do their mating rituals or reproduce at different times. Example would be orchids, right? So if you're a gardener, right, you know that in your garden you want like spring flowers and you want summer flowers, like you want your garden to look pretty like all throughout the year, because there are certain times when certain things come into flower, and then there are other times when other things come into flower. To use an animal example, right, birds usually reproduce during the spring, right, and then you have your large mammals like your deer and your elk and your moose and stuff like that reproduce during the fall. So there are different mating times for different species, including flowers and including animals. So that would be temporal isolation. So usually, if we would be in class, again, I would show you a YouTube video called Evolution in Action. It's all about salamanders. The University of California, Berkeley, I believe, did like shows a little example of um, yeah, possible evolution in action, possible macroevolution, possible like modern day example of geographic isolation and of splitting a salamander population. It's kind of interesting. It has a snappy little tune, so if you want to go ahead and look at that, you can. If not, that's fine. And then also like this is a YouTube lecture, right? It's great. This would usually take like 2 or 3 class periods if we were doing this normally. Because again, this is more of a conversation, which I encourage you to have with your parents around the dinner table if you would like. But yeah, there's a really good PBS documentary called What Darwin Never Knew. It's like an hour and 40 minutes long, and it goes into like how we understand evolution today, because we've progressed beyond Darwin's understanding, and we see that some of what Darwin said actually doesn't really hold water, right? Does that mean that evolution like isn't true at all? No, Darwin, remember, didn't come up with the idea of evolution. Darwin came up with the mechanism of natural selection, which actually kind of holds true, given all that we know right now. So if you want to go through and watch this, go ahead and do that. I encourage you to do that, but again, it's not required because I know that your time is precious and valuable. You have Instagramming and Snapchatting and TikToking to do, right? So probably one of the most famous examples of evolution would be Darwin's finches, right? And so I just want to really quickly just kind of model for you, well, not really model for you, but kind of like segue into your assignment, right? So here we have this population of finches on South America, right? And somehow, some way, for whatever reason, they travel across the ocean, and they get blown there by a storm, or their like magnetic like navigation in their head is off, and they're like, I think we should go this way, but we're actually going this way. And anyway, somehow they find their way to the Galapagos Islands. They just made this trip. They're not going to go back. This is a really long ways for a small little finch, a small little sparrow, songbird type thing. So the population on South America is reproductively isolated from the population on the Galapagos Islands. So now we have a population of finches on the Galapagos Islands, right? And these islands, they're kind of close. They're not really close, right? Again, finches are kind of like the squirrels, right? If there's food, if there's other finches on this island, they're not going to voluntarily go across to the other island and go exploring. They're kind of content to kind of stay where they are. But when the population gets too big over here and they're running out of resources, then hypothetically there could be another population of finches, a part of that population of finches that are like, you know what, peace, we're out of here. And so they go over to another island where there's abundant food and where there's no finches yet, right? And so then it's big enough that this group isn't going to intentionally fly back and see the relatives because they didn't like them anyways because they were taking all of their food, and they have enough food and they have other finches over here, so they're kind of happy to stay over here. So these two species are reproductively isolated, right? And if there's enough time that passes, if there's different mutations that happen, which there will be because DNA replication is not 100% every single time. Mutations happen, mistakes are made, right? So different environment, different mutations, and if we have enough time, then we'll see the evolution of two different species, the macroevolution of two different species on the Galapagos Islands. So that's hypothetically kind of how Darwin posited how we got so many different types of finches. And so obviously scientists like going back to the Galapagos Islands. That's kind of like Mecca for them, almost like Christians. They like going to Israel and the Promised Land, and there's a whole bunch of like tour companies that do that stuff like that. There's like a whole bunch of tour companies that will do tours of the Galapagos Islands for scientifically minded people because that's like their almost their sacred, their holy ground, right? So they'll go there and they'll study the finches, and there are 13 different species of finches, and so these finches have been studied ad nauseum, and they continue to be studied. They continue to evolve and they continue to change. And so that's well documented, right? The question is, like, how much change do you need before they're a non-mating group of like two groups of birds? How much change do you need before they can't produce fertile offspring anymore? So that's that. So now going back to that first that Y diagram, right? Now we're kind of previewing for our next lecture that we're going to have about evidence for evolution. So we can kind of think of that Y diagram, right, as this, right? So here we have our gene pool, and they're all intermingling and they're all reproducing, right? And then here we have our splitting event, and then that creates a node, right? If you take AP biology, you'll learn that this is called a cladogram, right, or a phylogenetic tree. And then these splitting events, these are nodes, and then you have two different lineages. So if we kind of take that idea and if we kind of zoom out, right, then we have our ancestral chordate, our ancestral animal with the backbone, right? And then we had a splitting event, and then part of that population evolved to become currently what are sharks, right? And then part of that population evolved to be currently what are everything else, right? And then we had another splitting event, and then part of that population evolved to be ray fin fishes. Another splitting event, part of that population evolved to be amphibians, right? Crocodiles, birds, right? Dinosaurs would kind of be in here. Dinosaurs, birds are modern day dinosaurs according to current evolutionary thinking, right? And then of course we have the rise of mammals, which of course we are the megafauna, the deer and the dolphins and the bats and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's kind of the idea. Speciation, these little splitting events right here, are kind of the background or the bedrock or the basis of these trees of life or phylogenetic trees, is what they're called. So that's kind of a preview for next lecture. And then if we zoom all the way out, right? So that last slide, that was kind of this area right here with the fish, the amphibians, amphibians, and then the reptiles, right, and then the birds, and then the mammals, right, represented by the cow here. So if we zoom all the way out, then we see that people think that all of life had a single common ancestor, and then there were splitting events, and then we had the true bacteria, and then there was another splitting event, and we had the archaebacteria, and then there were more splitting events, and we had kingdom protista, right, which is this green stuff right here, and then we had these are plants. This is Kingdom Plantae, right? And then this yellow right here is Kingdom Protista. And then this brown right here is Kingdom Fungi. And then this red right here is Kingdom Animalia. So we have our sea sponges, and we have our cnidarians, and we have our insects, and we have our roundworms, and we have our flatworms, and we have our gastropods, and we have our sea stars, and we have all sorts of stuff like that. So you can oh, there's the key right there. So you can see that. So Kingdom Protista is in yellow, Kingdom Plantae is in. So that's kind of the whole evolutionary thinking. That's what if you take macroevolution, if you take the reproductive isolation, the splitting events, and then you spread that out over, what was it, like 4.5, 4.6 billion years, then this possibly becomes feasible. This becomes a mean that God could have used to create the variety of life that we see on Earth. Of course, scientists wouldn't say that. They would say, "Oh no, it's random chance," because they study the natural world. They don't bring in the supernatural. They have a different worldview, right? So here's your assignment. Now we finally get to it. So your assignment: research the evolutionary classification of an animal of your choice, right? So step one, pick an animal. Step two, list the taxons that it belongs to. So taxons: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? So kingdom would be probably kingdom Animalia because you're picking an animal, right? And then all the way down to genus and species. So the genus and species for a human is Homo sapien, genus, species. Genus and species for the family dog is Canis familiaris, right? Genus and species for the gray wolf is Canis lupus, right? So that would be the scientific name, the genus and the species. Those are the two smallest taxons, the two groups that it belongs to. Research and describe its closest living relatives, so at least three. Research and describe at least three close living relatives. And then last but not least, list 5 similarities and 5 differences between your animal and its relatives. If you want some extra credit, draw an evolutionary tree. So that would be kind of like one of these things right here, of your animal and then of the 3 other animals that you research. If you want to include the differences in the evolutionary tree, then that'll be even more points, right? Let's see, an animal with at least 4 others. Change that to 3 others, right? Because you already researched 3 others right here. So, anyways, this has been Mr. Leo. Today we learned about the process of speciation and the different types of reproductive isolation. Hopefully this has been informative and educational and entertaining. And I will see you on the flip side.